Imagine a prince born into a life of staggering wealth and power, destined to rule an empire, who chooses to walk away from it all. Rather than lead armies, he decided to sit beneath a tree and contend with the internal mechanics of his own mind. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He would eventually become the Buddha, the awakened one. But first, he had to see the world his father had spent decades trying to hide. His story begins around 563 BCE in Lumbini, in the foothills of the Himalayas. Siddhartha's father, King Suddhodana, ruled the Shakya clan. At the boy's naming ceremony, seers predicted he had two possible futures. He would either become a world conqueror or a spiritual leader who would change the course of history. His father wanted a king, not a sage. To force that outcome, Suddhodana architected a world that never allowed for pain. He built a hermetically sealed reality, ordering the palace grounds to be cleared of anything that might hint at human suffering. Siddhartha spent his youth in seasonal estates, surrounded by gardens, musicians, and constant diversion. He married a princess of exceptional beauty, Yasodhara, and they had a son named Rahula. By every conventional metric, he possessed the perfect life his father had designed for him. But the luxury didn't provide the fulfillment the king expected. Instead, Siddhartha felt a growing sense of emptiness. He was beginning to realize that the palace was a gilded cage, and he was the prisoner inside it. At age 29, his curiosity finally pushed him past the palace walls. He persuaded his charioteer, Channa, to drive him into the city. Though the king had ordered the streets scrubbed of all misery, the prince's path crossed with 4 sights that would change him forever. He first saw a man bent with age, then a person burning with fever, and finally, a lifeless corpse being carried to the cremation ground. For the first time in his life, he was seeing the reality of decay and death. When Channa confirmed that everyone, including the prince himself, was subject to this same fate, the carefully maintained illusion of the palace shattered. Siddhartha realized that everything he owned and everyone he loved would eventually be lost. Then he saw a 4th figure, a wandering ascetic who appeared calm and serene despite the suffering surrounding him. This man offered Siddhartha a glimpse of a different way to live, one that didn't rely on the unstable comforts of a royal life. He returned to the palace, but the luxury now felt like a lie. He could no longer unsee the mortality that awaited every living being. That night, he made a choice that seems impossible to most. He went to his wife's chamber, looking at her and their sleeping infant son. He wanted to hold them, but feared losing his resolve to leave. He turned his back on his family and walked out of the room. He woke Channa and retrieved his horse, Kantaka. Together, they rode silently through the massive gates of Kapilavastu and into the dark, unknown world beyond. At the edge of a river, the prince performed a final act of shedding his past. He cut his long hair, removed his jewels, and traded his royal silks for the simple rags of a seeker. He stepped into the forest alone. He had spent half his life in total indulgence. Now he would try the opposite. He believed that by rejecting the material world entirely, he could find a way to escape the suffering he had seen in the streets. Siddhartha sought out the most respected meditation masters in India, mastering their techniques until he had nothing left to learn from them. But even in the deepest meditative states, the root of human sorrow still remained. He then joined a group of 5 ascetics who believed the mind could only be liberated by punishing the body. He spent the next 6 years in a stale, forcing himself to endure extreme heat, cold, and physical pain. He eventually reached a point eating 1 grain of rice daily. His body wasted away, his bones visible through his skin, leaving him a living skeleton on the verge of death. He realized that this path was just as distracting as the one he left behind. Where the palace had blinded him with pleasure, the forest was blinding him with agony. Starving his body wasn't bringing him closer to clarity. It was simply destroying the vessel he needed to think. He considered a lute string. Tuned too loosely, it produces no sound. Tuned too tightly, it breaks. It requires perfect center tension. Applying this, he accepted rice milk from a girl named Sujata, restoring his physical strength to maintain focus. This was the birth of what he called the middle way. It was a path that required abandoning the comfort of both extremes, to see the world as it actually is. Nourished, Siddhartha walked toward an ancient Bodhi tree at dusk. He took his seat, vowing not to rise until he understood the nature of suffering. He sat in deep meditation and touched the earth with his right hand, calling upon the ground beneath him to bear witness to his resolve. As the night deepened, he was confronted by Mara, the personification of his own internal impulses. Shadows of desire, fear, and ego converged on him, testing his focus with every distraction his mind could invent, but he remained unmoved. By finding the balance between the two lives he had lived, the prince had finished his struggle with the external world and was now ready to face the final layers of his own consciousness. Siddhartha Gautama spent 6 years pushing his body to the absolute brink. He eventually realized that starving himself only damaged his health without providing the mental clarity he sought. After regaining his strength with a simple bowl of rice milk, he walked to the quiet banks of the Niranjana River. There, he sat down beneath the sprawling branches of a fig tree. He made a single, unyielding vow. He would not rise from this spot until he uncovered the source of human suffering within his mind. He realized that the primary barriers to freedom are found in how we perceive and react to our own desires and fears. As his meditation deepened, he confronted a force known as Mara. In this tradition, Mara is a psychological personification, representing the cravings and deep-seated illusions that keep human beings chained to dissatisfaction. First, Mara deployed his armies, manifestations of fear and aggression, hurling storms of rock and fire. But Siddhartha's concentration was so absolute that the weapons transformed into harmless lotus petals before they could even touch him. Next, Mara sent his daughters, thirst, discontentment, and desire. Siddhartha observed them without attachment, watching as they dissolved into mist. Mara issued one final challenge, demanding to know who would bear witness to Siddhartha's right to claim enlightenment. Siddhartha reached down and touched the earth with his right hand. The ground roared in confirmation of his merit. Mara's forces shattered, and as the morning star rose, the struggle ended. By confronting these internal forces, Siddhartha transitioned from a seeker to the Buddha, the awakened one. He had cleared the internal brushwood, making room for the insights he was about to share. After his awakening, the Buddha walked to the deer park in Sarnath. He was looking for the 5 former companions who had abandoned him when he stopped his extreme ascetic practices. Although they initially planned to shun him, they were struck by his calm, luminous presence. They immediately offered him a seat and listened. Sitting with them beneath the trees, he described a middle way, a path of balance that avoids the dead ends of both sensual indulgence and extreme self-torture. This golden wheel represents the 4 noble truths he shared that day. It functions as a diagnosis. Suffering exists, it is caused by our cravings. That suffering can end, and there is a specific path to reach that end. The actionable part of this framework is the Noble Eightfold Path. Each spoke represents a specific discipline, ranging from right understanding and intention to mindfulness and concentration. This sermon provided a repeatable method for others to reach the same clarity Siddhartha had found beneath the fig tree. For the next 45 years, the Buddha walked the roads of northern India. He traveled through monsoon rains and dry heat, moving from village to share these insights. He taught a diverse range of people, from wealthy kings to mass murderers and social outcasts, showing the same compassion to each. He established a community known as the Sangha. He also accepted his stepmother as the first Buddhist nun, ensuring the practice was open to both men and women. Buddhism traveled across the continent because the message of personal insight offered a tangible alternative to the rigid social structures of the time. At the age of 80, the Buddha fell gravely ill after a meal. He traveled to Kushinagar and lay down to rest between 2 blooming sala trees. Surrounded by his followers, he offered his final advice. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. He then entered parinirvana. This is the final liberation. the moment a practitioner is released from the cycle of birth and death. His death served as the final demonstration of his teachings on impermanence, leaving the responsibility for the practice in the hands of each individual. This flowing visual illustrates the concept of anicca, or impermanence. It is the observation that all things constantly arise and pass away. We experience suffering when we try to hold on to things that are naturally changing. Recognizing this constant change helps break down the sense of a fixed, unchanging ego. It allows a person to navigate life with more balance and less friction. 2.5 millennia later, this framework is still practiced globally. It remains an unbroken lineage of meditation and mindfulness that continues into modern life. The Buddha's legacy remains a practical method for examining the human mind, a blueprint for waking up that requires no external deity to function.